Hi, everybody. My name is Alexis MacDonald-Anderson, and my presentation, Women, Rome's Catalysts of Change, introduces examples from ancient sources, biographers, and poets alike who made mention of female figures throughout the history of Rome and looks at the type of language they use when talking about different women from periods of Rome's history. These topics will be further discussed in my paper of the same name, and an analysis on the standards women are held to and what happens to them if they don't fit these standards will be looked at as well. Before we begin, there are some important trigger warnings. There will be mention of violence, violence against women, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, rape, and suicide. The women, Helen, the Sabine women, and Lucretia, were all important in the development of the city. The Romans had considered themselves descendants of Troy and used what people of past generations did in order to justify their future actions, thus bringing forth the point that the Roman women were doomed to be subjected to violence and hatred born right from the fires of Troy. While reading Seneca's play titled Phaedra, the character of Hippolytus says, quote, "Woman is the root of all evil," end quote, on line 559, going on to say, quote, "How many cities have been burned? How many wars have they caused?" End quote. This is not the only time in which women are spoken of in such a hateful way, and while Hippolytus is not talking about those who we will be speaking about, it is such a fantastic example of the type of language used when speaking of women, which brings us into discussion of a woman who deserves to have her story told time and time again until we get it right, Helen. To try to better understand the standards these women are being held to and why some are hated while others are revered for essentially similar reasons, we must understand the expectations women had to live up to. A document taught some aristocratic girls how to behave in order to prepare them as a wife. Pliny the Younger wrote that his wife, Calpurnia's devotion to him is, quote, "a sure indication of her virtue," end quote. And he also says that her interest in his writings were not from genuine curiosity, but an attempt to please him. It was also ideal for a woman to be talented, such as playing an instrument, singing, or by appreciating poetry. What Lucretia's rapist liked so much about Lucretia was that she was virtuous. While he and other men were going around checking in on what the wives were doing, Lucretia was the only one who was at home spinning wool and not, quote, passing her time in feasting and luxury. The men deemed these unexpected visits a way to find out about their characters on the spot. Lucretia's lament to her husband and Brutus before committing suicide shows us that a Roman virtuous woman didn't have sex with another man, even if it was rape. A woman was to do everything for her husband in order to please him. Homer wrote about a war in which two kings were fighting over a woman, the beautiful and virtuous Helen of Troy. In short, Helen was promised to Paris by Aphrodite if he agreed to say that the goddess was the most beautiful in a contest between Aphrodite, Athena, and Hera. Helen, a prize to be won, merely a body to be passed around, had been abducted by Paris and subjected to a forced marriage, upsetting her husband and thus beginning the Trojan War. Helen had been accused throughout the centuries of being overly sexual, of being the sole cause of the Trojan War, of being graceless and not a virtuous woman. Euripides, a Greek poet, especially hated Helen, saying that she was justly counted among the slaves in his play titled The Trojan Women. In an article by Bettany Hughes, Hughes mentions that there is a Christian and pagan manuscript in which Helen is depicted as pulling Paris towards infidelity, depicting her as a woman who is having an active role in the participation of a sin, thus not being virtuous in a Roman's eyes. Helen's virtuosity and reputation prior to her abduction has been erased in order to depict her as a villain, while the Sabine women and Lucretia are depicted as maintaining their virtuosity, giving themselves in order to better and benefit Rome. The Sabine women were abducted by the Roman men at the command of the founder of the city, Romulus. Livy writes that Rome's greatness was threatened to last for only one generation, since there were no women in the community to have children with, and the idea of intermarriage had been shut down. Thus, they decided to take women and girls from their families, and the Roman men married the Sabine women. Livy mentions the women were upset with their situation, being forcibly married to the Romans, and, in my opinion, likely forced to have children with them as well, and that a campaign had been launched to save the women and bring them home. The Sabine women blamed themselves for the war between the Roman men and the Sabine men, saying, quote, "Turn your anger upon us. It is we who are the cause of the war. It is we who have wounded and slain our husbands and fathers. Better for us to perish rather than live without one or the other of you, as widows or as orphans." End quote. While reading Livy's account of the rape and death of Lucretia, the wife of Lucius Tarquinius Colonnatus, one might be pleasantly surprised at the reception and description of her rape and death. Livy, being a historian, kept things to the facts. The facts being, Sextus Tarquin was welcomed into Lucretia's home, then, at night, went into Lucretia's bedroom with a sword, threatened to kill her, and then raped her. Lucretia called for her husband and Lucius Junius Brutus, and they assured her that she was not dishonorable. Then she replied, quote, "No, what can be well with a woman when her honor is lost?" Unquote, and killed herself. This suicide sparked anger in the Romans, specifically Brutus, who vowed to avenge her death and be away with the monarchy. They tried to save Lucretia from herself, tried to tell her that she was a victim and that nothing was her fault, but the ideal of Roman womanly virtue runs deep, and in her eyes, her reputation was ruined. However, this begs the questions. Why did the Republic have to get created once a woman had been harmed? Why did a woman have to lose her life in order for the Roman aristocrats to finally realize just how troubled and dangerous having one sole ruler was? Why did this change happen after not only one woman, but countless women had been taken from their families to better Rome in the event of the Sabine women? Lucretia's rape has been tied to the creation of a rich and powerful republic, a republic that it was created at the expense of a woman's life. This story is not Lucretia's. It is the story of Lucretia and the republic. She is not her own entity. So what happened in the case of Helen? The Sabine women and Lucretia, among many other women, were afraid of what would happen to them and their reputations if they hadn't acted as virtuous women, seeing that Helen was subjected and is still subjected to slander and defamation. Helen, a woman who was abducted and then depicted as a willing participant in the forced relationship between her and Paris, was used and has continued to be used as a symbol of how not to act. Helen is frequently depicted as sexual, and her beauty was considered dangerous, and being sexual has always been considered taboo and sinful, especially for a woman. While Lucretia and the Sabine women claimed that the violence against them was their fault, Helen wasn't written to feel that way. The key here is that, more often than not, in the written record, the authors didn't write how Helen felt about her abduction at all. Shakespeare calls her a strumpet, the equivalent of calling someone a prostitute, and in his play Troilus and Cressida, he writes that Helen wasn't worth all of the effort. Painters who depict the scene of her abduction or her relationship with Paris, even centuries later, again and again, she looks to be full of adoration and desire for Paris, but we don't know how she truly felt. This adoration can see on the left side of the slide here. The reason Helen is depicted as a sexual snake in the grass is that she is depicted as a cause for destruction against the good guys. the people that the Romans had considered their ancestors, making her, quote, the graceless Helen, who destroyed a city and started a war when the real cause of the war was her abduction. Our conclusion is simple. The ancients prove that a woman was not virtuous unless she gave herself only to her husband or to Rome. Time and time again, Helen has been the subject of defamation while suffering in a loveless, forced marriage, her narrative not even getting the chance to be told, let alone to be erased from history. The Sabine women and Lucretia, also victims of forced marriage, rape, and left to live in fear of not fulfilling the ideal womanly virtue, have been immortalized as great women. Yet why is it that they are only great once they have been subjected to the horrors of violence against women? These events could have been avoided. They could have been left alone to be happy and safe, yet they and their bodies were used by the Roman men to better the city. The Sabine women were manipulated by Romulus, the first leader of Rome, and they developed Stockholm syndrome. Sextus Tarquinius followed in the footsteps of Paris and Romulus, feeling that he was entitled to use Lucretia just to satisfy himself. These women deserve justice rather than depicting them in the ways which they have been depicted.